Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm Peter LaBelle. All right, I have Kieran George back. This is the second part of our discussion on two interesting articles that came out of Politico in the last few days about should we reset relations with Russia. Kieran, let me go to you. One of the, and we just touched about it in our first video, but neither letter talks about Russia's national interest because you said earlier this is bipartisan. Well, I would just call this the foreign policy blob. Some are notable, some are less notable. Some have real experience, some actually have no experience, but they're called an expert. That's usual. But there's no legitimate, genuine attempt to say, huh, what do the Russians want, actually? Why are we having so many problems here? Okay, I mean, look at they stole territory in Ukraine. Well, in August of 2008, it was Saakashvili's military that invaded South Ossetia. Now, you couldn't say South Ossetia was part of Georgia. Well, no, this was a contested territory ever since the end of the Soviet Union. Okay, there's real history here, and on top of it, there's agency. South Ossetians have agency. Let's go to Ukraine. Occupying Donbass and Crimea. Well, you overturned the government illegally, threw out a democratically elected government, President Yanukovych, and this is what happened. It was a fragile country, and you broke it. It wasn't. If you hadn't done that, Crimea would still be part of Ukraine. Okay, if you hadn't done that, 13,000 people wouldn't be dead in the Donbass. Oh, and by the way, people of the Donbass have agency as well. See, just these simple things right now. Syria, under international law, Russia's in Syria legally. The United States is there illegally. Neither letter addresses the illegal behavior of the United States. It's illegal usage of sanctions. Russia was sanctioned on assumptions, not on facts, okay? That's not mentioned either. And I'll end with my rant with this. I thought the Mueller report's out. Did anybody read it? No collusion with the Trump campaign in Russia. But these two letters don't even give a pretense of even acknowledging any of the points I've just made. And that's just off the top of my head. Go ahead, Karen.
I agree with you completely. But I also think that the biggest thing you can take away from this letter, and with how things are put in the letter, is that the US is not that different from Russia in terms of.
I disagree.
In terms of internal turmoil. So, for example, first of all, Russian interests and US interests are at a completely different sides of the spectrum. That's just a fact. They do not have the same interest. They do not have the same national interest. I think that's also something that everyone understands. Like Syria, they have different interests. But when you look at sanctions as well, I think the US can be held accountable because, first of all, it doesn't have a very credible record, does it, at giving sanctions? It's very good at placing sanctions on other countries. It's not very good at receding those and rescinding sanctions when countries have applied and themselves and have changed and done whatever they were supposed to do. For example, Iran. Right. It's very easy to sanction a country. It's not very easy to take away those sanctions. So under the first letter, it vouches towards a more flexible sanction-making policy, which they don't actually explain what that means and what that entails. But given the record of sanction placing, a not very strong record of taking away sanctions, I don't understand how that will improve relations.
But that's in fact the interesting thing about the first letter, because it's very interesting that you allude to that, Kira, because it says, we need flexibility when it comes to sanctions, because once we impose them, it's very hard to rescind them. Mm-hmm. But in fact, their proposal for rescinding is if Russia does this, this, and this, and then we will take back some of the sanctions. Yeah. Well, that's it. That's the official position of the U.S. government. It's always Russia that has to do all of these things. If the first letter writers had any courage and really had any serious intention of improving relations with Russia, then they should come up and offer a unilateral gesture. I mean, they've got any number of unilateral gestures that they could offer. Let's put a moratorium on these elections. So forget about these elections. We both interfere in one another's elections. We know this. Let's stop all this nonsense and pretending that we don't. That could be a unilateral gesture.
How about George?
It's
How
always,
about this?
oh, you have to do this, this, and this, and then we'll lift the sanctions.
How about this? Something that a message of goodwill. NATO will no longer expand east.
Yeah.
Make that official policy. Okay, make
Yeah.
that official policy. Okay, that would be a gesture that would be understood. One of the things, it's kind of my pet peeve, and George and I will betray our age here, but in our lifetime, during the worst times of the Cold War, arms agreement kept things going. Okay, that was something you could always cling to keep a relationship moving, even if it was a difficult time. But that's not the case we have now, and we have this under different administrations here, and again, I mean, you alluded to, well, you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, what are the Russians or anybody else in the world supposed to think of the U.S. government? Is that you sign an agreement, you walk away from agreement, and then you say you're still in the agreement when you're not in the agreement, and you still have demands? I mean, from the outside looking in, can you trust these people? I mean, yes. There's an assumption built into these letters that the U.S. foreign policy is noble. No foreign policy is noble. It's based on interests, cold, hard interests, okay? There's no nobility in foreign policy. And both of these letters are just, I mean, it's like wokeism on the international stage.
But the point about the arms control agreements is that they always took place in the context of détente. I mean, if you think of the very first agreement about the open skies, the very first version of the open skies treaty, it took place under Eisenhower, which was the first détente in the Cold War. Then, of course, the heyday of détente was the late 60s, early 1970s. Enormous number of arms control agreements were signed. The SALT, the ABM treaties, and so on. It was when détente collapsed in the late 70s and early 80s, then suddenly there were no more arms control agreements. And this is the problem with the Democrats, who unlike Trump, kind of still talk about, oh, let's have arms control. So we still think the Russians are absolutely the lowest form of life on Earth, but we should have a safe world without danger of nuclear weapons. Well, that's not going to happen. No one's going to agree to sign a deal with the people who are the worst, scummiest people in the world. So the Democrats are being thoroughly disingenuous when they say, well, we need to sort of have renew the New START treaty. It's not going to happen, which is why the JCPOA, sorry, I just finished now. The JCPOA turned out to be such a flop because Obama didn't try to use it as foreign policy improving relations with Iran. Had he done that, then it would have been much harder to walk away from it in the way that Trump did, because everyone said, well, hey, Iran, they're the worst terrorist state in the world. Even Obama agreed with that. So, of course, we're going to walk away from it.
You know, Kira, one of the things, again, reading these two letters here, again, during the Cold War, there was a serious, and the word mature came in mind, serious, mature attempt to put yourself in the other guy's shoes. And I think they did that. They did that. How do they see this all? Okay, that is not occurring. It hasn't occurred for a long time. It hasn't occurred since the advent of the unipolar moment. I mean, who cares what they think? Because that's the mentality. Okay, and there's not even the thought of, well, maybe the Russians don't trust us anymore. I mean, why are we writing this? Does anybody know? Does anybody know? Because, I mean, diplomatic relations have been so degraded, shuttering of embassies based on claims that have no evidence to them whatsoever. Maybe the guys in the Kremlin just aren't interested anymore, okay? I mean, and I don't even think that crosses the mind of these people in both letters.
Mm-hmm. But working on that assumption, though, then that during the Cold War, the relations were better after the Cold War, the relations kind of had this thaw with Yeltsin and Gorbachev. But although they were both very popular outside of Russia, actually within Russia, they weren't at all popular.
Right.
Yeah, but the thing is that the Gorbachev and Yeltsin were abject failures when it comes to Russia's national interest on the international stage. And that is why, it's one of the things that I find very frustrating is that it's because of Western behavior and because they love to use that word behavior towards Russia that made Putin possible. They made Putin. They made him or someone like him an historical inevitability. George,
But
do you
that's the
agree
thing,
with
that the national interest of Russia is security. And ultimately, you think this is a country that within the last 100 years or so suffered two massive, horrific invasions. Now, that is a trauma. And that is not something that's just going to go away. And for anyone to start talking about, well, we could have Belarus or Ukraine in NATO, and you don't think about what goes on in the minds of people who have been subjected to these horrific, massive invasions, then you're going to end in trouble, because then you're not really understanding what goes on in the Russian mind. And this is what you alluded to, Peter, when you talk about the Cold War. When Nixon went to Moscow in 1972 and he addressed the Soviet people, he talked about World War II, the trauma that was caused by World War II. Jack Kennedy, in his famous American University address in the summer of '63, again talked about the trauma of World War II. You can't start negotiating with them if you don't appreciate what the fear of invasion for them is. And this Americans seem to have no idea about at all.
Kira, in the second letter, it's touched upon in the first letter, but it's focused on in the second letter is that, we have to invest our soft power skills and NGOs with the Russian people. Well, I find that so dishonest, so very dishonest. Look at the sanctions against Venezuela. Has Venezuela attacked the United States? Is Venezuela a proxy to damage American national interest? There's no evidence of that. Look at the sanctions against Venezuela. Look at the sanctions against the people of Syria. Look at the new sanctions against the people of Lebanon after that horrific explosion. I mean, why should we take at face value that they're being genuine? No, they want to undermine the current political order of a country that they deem as a national threat. So I find it appallingly dishonest. Go ahead.
No, but I also think in that the second letter's quote, I think, well, first of all, the whole point of that section is to separate the government from the Russian people and to cast the Russian people as this long-suffering, tolerant population who are just putting up with a regime that they are under forcibly. And obviously this is a farce, because if you look at the statistics that they cite and you go to this Levanta site, they say that they quote something like 3% of Russian people view the US as a threat, or as a US something that you should be concerned about. But these statistics, whichever group of people you may have asked to produce such statistics, fair enough. But if you scratch this a tiny bit and go deeper and below into the surface, look at other similar surveys, the same think tank, Levanta think tank, produced a survey, it was last year, and it was something like 83% of Russian people consider the US Russia's #1 enemy, for example.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point, because the Russians were very favorably disposed towards the U.S. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, and they have a very bad experience of that essentially they almost basically went down on their knees in surrender, and the Americans just simply took advantage of them. And when they see these NATO military exercises in the Baltic, on the Black Sea, and trying to rope Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, they feel threatened. Not to mention the sanctions and everything else that they're continually inflicting on Russia.
Yeah.
Okay, we're quickly running out of time. I'd like to kind of stress something that George said earlier in our previous video here. I think the underlying message, theme of actually both letters, and one is more explicit than the other, is that China, they're worried they're going to lose Russia completely now because of China. And I think that's something that's really interesting. And I find it really disappointing that neither letter can seriously address that issue. Because you know why? Because it's the signers of both letters that we're in this situation. That's it from us here at the Goggle. We have Kira, we have George, and me. And like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.